This is the history of protest songs in the United States. Part 7. The 20th Century. In the 20th century, the Union Movement, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and the war in Vietnam all inspired protest songs. 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. The 1960s was a fertile era for the genre, especially with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, the ascendancy of counterculture groups such as hippies and the New Left, and the escalation of the war in Vietnam. The protest songs of the period differed from those of earlier leftist movements, which had been more oriented towards labor activism and adopting instead a broader definition of political activism commonly called social activism, which incorporated notions of equal rights and of promoting the concept of peace. The music often included relatively simple instrumental accompaniment, including acoustic guitar and harmonica. Many Americans still remember Odetta Holmes' performance at the 1963 Civil Rights Movement's March on Washington, where she sang, "Oh Freedom." One of the key figures of the 1960s protest movement was Bob Dylan, who produced a number of landmark protest songs, such as "Blowin' in the Wind," 1962, "Masters of War," 1963, "Talking World War III Blues," 1963, and "The Times They Are A-Changin'," 1964. While Dylan is often thought of as a protest singer, most of his protest songs spring from a relatively short time period in his career. Mike Marcusy writes, "The protest songs that made Dylan famous and with which he continues to be associated were written in a brief period of some 20 months, from January 1962 to November 1963. Influenced by American radical traditions, the Wobblies, the Popular Front of the 30s and 40s, the beat anarchists of the 50s, and above all by the political ferment touched off among young people by the civil rights and ban the bomb movements, he engaged in his songs with the terror of the nuclear arms race, with poverty, racism and prison, jingoism and war. Dylan often sang against injustice, such as the murders of Emmett Till and the death of Emmett Till, 1962, and civil rights movement activist Medgar Evers in "Only a Pawn in Their Game," 1964, or the killing of the 51-year-old African-American barmaid Hattie Carroll by the wealthy young tobacco farmer from Charles County, William Devereux, Billy Zanzinger in "The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll," 1964. Zanzinger was sentenced to 6 months in a county jail for the murder. Many of the injustices about which Dylan sang were not even based on race or civil rights issues, but rather everyday injustices and tragedies, such as the death of boxer Davey Moore in the ring. Who killed Davey Moore? 1964, or the breakdown of farming and mining communities. Ballad of Hollis Brown, 1963. North Country Blues, 1963. By 1963, Dylan and then singing partner Joan Baez had become prominent in the civil rights movement, singing together at rallies including the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. However, Dylan, glancing towards the Capitol, is reported to have asked, cynically, "Think they're listening?" Then he is also reported to have answered, "No, they ain't listening at all." Anthony Scaduto contends that many of Dylan's songs of the period were adapted and appropriated by the 1960s civil rights and counterculture movements, rather than being specifically written for them. Scaduto reports that by 1964 Dylan was attempting to extract himself from the movement, much to the chagrin of many of those who saw him as a voice of a generation. Indeed, some of Dylan's topical songs appear to have been retrospectively aligned with issues which they in fact predate. For example, Masters of War, 1963, which protests against governments who orchestrate war, is sometimes misconstrued as dealing directly with the Vietnam War. However, the song was written at the beginning of 1963, when only a few hundred Green Berets were stationed in South Vietnam, and came to be reappropriated as a comment on Vietnam in 1965, when U.S. planes bombed North Vietnam for the first time, with lines such as, "You that build the death planes," seeming particularly prophetic. In contrast to other topical singers of the day, Dylan never mentioned Vietnam by name in any of his songs. Dylan himself has stated rather mysteriously that, although the song is supposed to be a pacifistic song against war, it's not an anti-war song. It's speaking against what Eisenhower was calling a military-industrial complex as he was making his exit from the presidency. That spirit was in the air, and I picked it up. This understandably must have seemed a distinction without much of a difference to his many anti-war fans. Similarly, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, 1963, was perceived by some as about the Cuban Missile Crisis, although Dylan had composed and performed it more than a month before John F. Kennedy's TV address to the nation, October 22, 1962, initiated the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dylan's initial and extremely fruitful 20-month period of overt protest songs ended in 1964, when he changed his musical style from what he termed finger-pointing, acoustic folk to increasingly personal, abstract lyrics. As he explained to Nat Hentoff in mid-1964, "Me, I don't want to write for people anymore, be a spokesman. From now on, I want to write from inside me. I'm not part of no movement. I just can't make it with any organization." In 1965, however, he reproached fans in Northern England when they booed him for allegedly abandoning the left, saying, "Come on, all my songs are protest songs." Ray Pratt, professor of political science at Montana State University, believes that Dylan stopped writing anthems and other explicit protest songs because he felt that, under the highly repressive conditions prevailing at the time, there was no side with which he wanted to be associated. "It's vulgar, the idea that somebody has to say what they want to say in a message-type song. Which side are you on? That's such a waste. I mean, which side can you be on?" His next explicit topical protest song would be Hurricane, written 12 years later, in 1976. Pete Seeger, founding member of the Almanac Singers and the Weavers, was a major influence on Dylan and his contemporaries, and continued to be a strong voice of protest in the 1960s, when he composed "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?", written with Joe Hickerson, and Turn, 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 written during the 1950s but released on Seeger's 1962 album The Bitter and the Sweet. Seeger's song, If I Had a Hammer, written with Lee Hayes in 1949 in support of the progressive movement, rose to top 10 popularity in 1962 when covered by Peter, Paul and Mary, going on to become one of the major freedom songs of the civil rights movement. We Shall Overcome, Seeger's adaptation of an American gospel song, continues to be used to support issues from labor rights to peace movements. Seeger was one of the leading singers to protest against then-President Lyndon Johnson through song. Seeger first satirically attacked the president with his 1966 recording of Len Chandler's children's song, Beans in My Ears. In addition to Chandler's original lyrics, Seeger sang that Mrs. J's little son Albie had beans in his ears, which, as the lyrics imply, ensures that a person does not hear what is said to them. To those opposed to continuing the Vietnam War, the phrase suggested that Albie J, a loose pronunciation of Johnson's nickname, ELBJ, did not listen to anti-war protests as he too had beans in his ears. Seeger attracted wider attention in 1967 with his song, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, about a captain, referred to in the lyrics as the Big Fool, who drowned while leading a platoon on maneuvers in Louisiana during World War II. In the face of arguments with the management of CBS about whether the song's political weight was in keeping with the usually light-hearted entertainment of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, the final lines were, "Every time I read the paper, those old feelings come on. We are waist deep in the big muddy and the big fool says to push on." And it was not seriously contested that much of the audience would grasp Seeger's allegorical casting of Johnson as the big fool, and the Vietnam War the foreseeable danger. Although the performance was cut from the September 1967 show, after wide publicity, it was broadcast when Seeger appeared again on the Smothers Brothers show the following January. Phil Oakes, one of the leading protest singers of the decade, or, as he preferred, a topical singer, performed at many political events, including anti-Vietnam War and civil rights rallies, student events, and organized labor events over the course of his career, in addition to many concert appearances at such venues as New York City's The Town Hall and Carnegie Hall. Politically, Oakes described himself as a left social democrat who turned into an early revolutionary after the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which had a profound effect on his state of mind. Some of his best-known protest songs include Power and the Glory, Draft Dodger Rag, There But for Fortune, Changes Crucifixion, When I'm Gone, Love Me, I'm a Liberal, Links on the Chain, Ringing of Revolution, and I Ain't Marching Anymore. Other notable voices of protest from the period included Joan Baez, Buffy Sainte-Marie, whose anti-war song, Universal Soldier, was later made famous by Donovan and Tom Paxton. Lyndon Johnson told The Nation about the escalation of the war in Vietnam, Jimmy Newman, The Story of a Dying Soldier, and My Son John, about a soldier who returns from war unable to describe what he's been through, among others. The first protest song to reach number 1 in the United States was P.F. Sloan's Eve of Destruction, performed by Barry McGuire in 1965.